I still have the first text he ever sent me. I don't know how to make it through tonight. 3 years and thousands of messages later, he couldn't even look me in the eye when I ran into him at the coffee shop. It was never supposed to become what it did, just a simple act of kindness toward a coworker going through a rough patch. That's how most toxic dependencies begin, I suppose, with good intentions paving the road to emotional hell. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. I met Alex during my second week at Meridian Publishing. He was the senior editor everyone warned me about, brilliant but volatile, the kind who could tear apart your work Monday morning, then invite you for drinks Friday night like nothing happened. I was the new copy editor, eager to prove myself, determined to avoid office politics. We barely interacted those first few months, just professional nods in the hallway, brief comments during team meetings. I noticed things about him, though, the dark circles under his eyes that never seemed to fade, how he'd disappear for hours, then return with red-rimmed eyes, the way he'd check his phone obsessively, his expression falling each time. It was ordinary office observation until the night everything shifted. Our team had been working late on a rushed manuscript, some celebrity memoir the company had bet big on. Past midnight, I headed to the break room for more coffee and found Alex sitting alone, staring at his phone, tears silently streaming down his face. I nearly backed out, embarrassed to have witnessed something so private, but he looked up before I could escape, hastily wiping his eyes with his sleeve. An awkward moment passed between us, his mumbled apology, my hesitation at the threshold, the invisible boundary between coworkers and personal crisis hovering in the air. In retrospect, I should have nodded sympathetically and left, should have respected that boundary. Instead, I crossed it, asking if he was okay, if there was anything I could do. Simple questions, the kind decent humans ask when witnessing distress. I couldn't have known those questions would entangle me in someone else's darkness for the next 3 years. His confession spilled out haltingly at first, then in a flood. His fiancée had left him. She'd been seeing someone else for months. She was moving in with her new lover tomorrow. 8 years together, destroyed. A wedding planned for fall, now canceled. All the signs he should have seen, all the ways he'd failed. A standard heartbreak narrative, nothing I hadn't heard before. What wasn't standard was what happened after we finally left the office around 2 a.m. Standing in the parking lot, he looked at me with an intensity that should have been my first warning, the desperation in his expression, the unspoken plea in his eyes when he mentioned not knowing how he'd go back to their shared apartment. Everything there reminded him of her. My suggestions came automatically. A hotel, a friend's place, normal solutions to a temporary problem. His response changed everything. He had no one, she had been his whole life. The raw despair in his voice pulled at something in me, something I'd later recognize as my own need to be needed. I gave him my number, told him to text if things got too overwhelming, a small offering of support that seemed appropriate in the moment. 20 minutes after I got home, my phone buzzed with his first message. He didn't know how to make it through the night. The first text in what would become thousands. I didn't sleep that night, neither did Alex. Our exchange continued until sunrise, my reassurances, his cycling between despair, rage, and bewilderment. By morning, I felt responsible for him in a way I couldn't articulate, like I'd been handed something fragile that would shatter if I set it down too roughly. The dynamic established itself with frightening speed. At work, we maintained professional distance. After hours, my phone became his lifeline. His pain was constant, overwhelming. No perspective I offered seemed to help, yet he kept coming back for more. His late-night messages expressing how I was the only one who understood, the only one he could talk to about this. Those words should have been another warning. Instead, they fed something in me, a need to be exceptional, irreplaceable. I began structuring my evenings around his crises, keeping my phone volume up even in movie theaters, anxiously checking for messages when I was out with friends. A month in, his texts took a darker turn, thoughts of ending it all, not seeing any point anymore, observations that no one would really miss him. I was 27 with no training in mental health crisis management. I should have directed him to professionals. Instead, I spent hours talking him back from these edges, terrified that if I failed, anything that happened would be my fault. I researched suicide prevention techniques between editing sessions, kept lists of crisis hotlines ready to send him, developed my own informal protocols for assessing his risk level. After these episodes, his gratitude was overwhelming, expressions of how lost he'd be without me, assertions that I was saving his life. I wish I could say I didn't believe him, that I saw through the manipulation from the beginning, but the truth is more humiliating. I embraced the role, savior, emotional support human, the one person standing between him and the abyss. It's embarrassing now to recall how quickly I reorganized my life around his needs. I started declining social invitations, wary of being unavailable when crisis struck. Began dating less, finding it exhausting to manage both my love life and Alex's emotional emergencies. Without consciously deciding to, I made myself constantly accessible to someone who gave almost nothing in return. 2 months into this pattern, my roommate Danny confronted me as I paced our living room at 1 a.m., phone pressed to my ear, trying to talk Alex through another crisis. Her concerns after I hung up, her observation that I wasn't his therapist, my defensive response about his tough time, about him not having anyone else, her pointed comment that adults have support systems, friends, family, questioning why I had become his entire emotional infrastructure. I dismissed her, convinced she simply didn't understand the depth of his pain, the stakes involved. How could I abandon someone who needed me so desperately? Yet in quiet moments, questions nibbled at the edges of my certainty. Why didn't Alex have other friends to lean on? Why had his ex-fiancée left so abruptly, with apparently no warning signs? Why did our conversations always center his pain, never addressing my increasingly obvious exhaustion? I got partial answers 3 months in when I ran into Kate from accounting at a coffee shop near our office. We weren't close, but the company wasn't huge and everyone knew everyone peripherally. Her question about how I was holding up, her pointed reference to me as Alex's new emotional support person, the knowing look in her eyes as she mentioned Melissa from marketing, Jard from design, and others. My stomach dropped at her revelations. Alex had a pattern, she explained. After Stephanie left him, he had latched onto Melissa. Before that, it was Jard, always someone new at the company. Always the same story, midnight texts, suicide threats, being the only one who understands. And according to Kate, it never ended well. I tried to dismiss her words as office gossip, but they burrowed under my skin. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I scrolled back through Alex's social media, past the recent breakup posts, past the happy couple photos with his ex-fiancée Stephanie, back 2 years, 3 years. There I found the patterns, the passionate public tributes to friends who'd saved him during dark times, the subsequent vague posts about betrayal and abandonment, the cycle repeating with new names, new faces, the dramatic falling outs documented in cryptic status updates that garnered dozens of sympathetic comments. When I carefully confronted him about these past relationships, his breakdown seemed genuine. His admission that yes, he'd had intense friendships that ended badly. His explanation that those people had ultimately abandoned him when he needed them most. They'd grown tired of his problems, had told him he was too much, had failed him when he was most vulnerable. Then came his earnest assurance that I was different, that I actually cared, that I didn't see him as a burden, the intensity in his eyes as he said it. I should have recognized the manipulation, how he'd turned the confrontation into an opportunity to deepen my commitment. Should have seen the implied threat. If I backed away, I'd be just like those others who had failed him. Instead, I recommitted, doubled down, convinced myself that I was indeed different, more compassionate, more patient, more capable of handling the emotional labor he required. The irony is that while I was saving Alex, I was slowly drowning. My work suffered as I operated on too little sleep. My friends grew frustrated with my constant cancellations. Danny eventually moved out, tired of living with someone whose life revolved around their phone and another person's crises. Her parting observation stung with truth. I'd become a supporting character in my own life. Her hope that someday I'd realize what this was costing me. I dismissed her words as dramatic, told myself that meaningful human connection sometimes required sacrifice, that being there for someone in genuine pain was worth the disruption to my life. 6 months in, I got my first glimpse of what it would cost when I missed my grandmother's 75th birthday celebration because Alex had threatened self-harm that same weekend. I sat in my apartment for 2 days, alternating between talking him down over the phone and texting reassurances, while my family celebrated 300 miles away. My mother called afterward, concern evident in her voice. Her observation about the third family event I'd missed that year, her question about what was going on with me. My vague explanations about work stress and personal issues, unwilling to admit that I'd become voluntarily shackled to someone else's emotional needs, that I was missing my own life to sustain his. The truth I couldn't acknowledge yet was that somewhere along the way, Alex's pain had become my identity. His dependence on me gave me purpose, made me feel irreplaceable in a way nothing else did. The constant crisis kept me from facing my own stagnation, the novel I'd stopped writing, the promotion I wasn't pursuing, the relationships I wasn't building. As long as I was saving Alex, I didn't have to save myself. The signs were there all along, I just refused to read them. The way he'd mention other friends who had let him down, subtly warning me not to do the same. how my own problems were acknowledged briefly before the conversation inevitably swung back to his needs, the pattern of his crises intensifying whenever I attempted to establish boundaries. 7 months into this dynamic, I began dating someone, Ben, a graphic designer I met through a mutual friend. For the first time in months, I silenced my phone during our dates, let myself be present with someone whose emotional state wasn't perpetually precarious. Alex sensed the shift immediately. His texts grew more frequent, more urgent. His crises escalated in both intensity and timing, somehow always occurring just before I was scheduled to see Ben. Messages about taking too many sleeping pills 20 minutes before dinner plans, my canceled dates, my rushing to his apartment, only to find him groggy but nowhere near the emergency he'd implied. These false alarms became so frequent that Ben eventually ended things between us. His observation during our final conversation cut deep. He was competing with someone who wasn't even my boyfriend. His assessment that whatever this was, it wasn't healthy, and he couldn't be part of it. I couldn't even argue. The pattern was too obvious, the manipulation too clear when viewed through an outsider's eyes. Yet still I couldn't extract myself. Every time I tried to create distance, Alex would plunge into crisis. Every boundary I attempted to establish would be met with accusations of abandonment, reminders of how everyone else had failed him. His pained expressions, his wounded tone when suggesting he'd been wrong about me too. And I'd relent, retreat from whatever limit I'd tried to set, return to my role as his emotional caretaker, telling myself it was temporary, that he was making progress, that someday he'd be stable enough for me to step back without catastrophic consequences. That day never came. Instead, the first real crack in our dysfunctional dynamic arrived from an unexpected source, his ex-fiancée Stephanie, who contacted me through social media nearly a year after that night in the break room. Her message was simple but chilling. We needed to talk about Alex. I wasn't the first, and unless something changed, I wouldn't be the last. I stared at Stephanie's message for hours, typing and deleting responses. Part of me wanted to ignore her completely, to protect both Alex and the role I'd carved out in his life, but curiosity and growing doubt won out. We arranged to meet at a small cafe across town, far from Meridian Publishing's offices, on a Sunday when Alex typically slept late. She arrived before me, nursing a cappuccino at a corner table. Nothing about her matched the villain Alex had described in his late-night trauma dumps. No visible horns, no obvious signs of cruelty, just a tired-looking woman with intelligent eyes and a wary expression. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct, no preamble, no small talk, just an immediate, devastating question. How much of myself had I already sacrificed for Alex's bottomless need? The accuracy of her question stunned me. Before I could formulate a defense, she placed a small journal on the table between us. A documentation of her 8 years with Alex, not lovesick ramblings or relationship mementos, but a methodical record of patterns I recognized with sickening clarity. Emotional manipulation, manufactured crises, isolation tactics, the calculated timing of his meltdowns whenever she tried to pursue her own interests or spend time with family and friends. Page after page revealed a blueprint so familiar it made my skin crawl. The late-night emergencies, the suicide threats, the declarations that she was the only one who understood, the only one who truly cared, the same words, sometimes verbatim, that filled my text history with him. Her revelations continued, each more disturbing than the last. The friend who had warned her about Alex early in their relationship, dismissed as jealous when she mentioned it to him. The therapist Alex had seen briefly, then quit because they were trying to turn her against him. The family members he'd gradually alienated with demands and emergencies until she barely saw them. The dreams she'd abandoned, graduate school, a career change, a trip to Japan, all sacrificed to the altar of his perpetual emotional needs. Her breaking point came after finding similar journals hidden in his desk drawer, records of previous relationships following the same toxic pattern. She'd confronted him, thinking they could work through it together. His response had been swift and brutal, a complete character assassination campaign among their friends, painting her as unstable, cruel, abandoning him during his darkest time. By the time she moved out, half their social circle wouldn't speak to her. As she spoke, I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my text history with Alex, found evidence of his crises conveniently erupting the night before my job interview for a senior position, the sudden emergency when I'd planned to attend my cousin's wedding, the health scare that coincided exactly with the writing retreat I'd been looking forward to for months. The pattern was undeniable, yet my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe Alex didn't realize what he was doing. Maybe his pain was so overwhelming that the timing was coincidental. Maybe Stephanie was the vindictive ex he'd portrayed, trying to poison his new relationships. Stephanie watched the emotions cross my face with weary recognition. She'd been exactly where I was, she explained, had made the same excuses, had believed she was different, stronger, more compassionate, more committed than whoever came before. She'd spent years believing she could fix him with enough love, enough patience, enough sacrifice. She hadn't come to vilify Alex, she insisted. Mental health struggles were real, emotional pain was valid, but his behavior went beyond struggle into deliberate manipulation. The calculated timing of his crises, the triangulation of relationships to isolate his chosen support person, the subtle punishment when boundaries were enforced. These weren't symptoms, they were strategies. Most chillingly, she revealed the aftermath of their breakup from Alex's perspective. The story he'd told me, that she'd been cheating for months, that she'd left without warning, was entirely fabricated. The reality, after discovering his journals and enduring months of escalating control tactics, she'd given him 3 options: serious psychiatric help, couples counseling, or separation. He'd chosen separation, then immediately rewritten the narrative to cast himself as the blindsided victim. The cafe grew busier around us, but I barely noticed. My mind replayed every interaction with Alex, recategorizing moments I'd interpreted as vulnerability into calculated manipulations. The times he'd shown up at my apartment unannounced when I hadn't answered texts fast enough. The subtle digs about friends who didn't understand our connection. The praise when I canceled plans to comfort him, followed by coldness when I enforced even the smallest boundary. Stephanie didn't push me to cut ties with Alex. That decision had to be mine, she said, but she urged me to pay attention to patterns I'd been ignoring, to document the timing of his crises, to notice what happened when I prioritized my needs, to be honest with myself about what this relationship was costing me. As we parted ways, she handed me her card. She worked in publishing too, but at a competitor across town. A final comment lingered between us. I wasn't the first person she'd had this conversation with in the year since leaving Alex, just the first who had agreed to meet. The evidence mounted in the weeks that followed. I created a simple spreadsheet, logging Alex's emergencies against my scheduled plans. The correlation was too perfect to be coincidence. Major crises aligned precisely with significant events in my life: job opportunities, family gatherings, potential romantic connections. Minor meltdowns corresponded with smaller personal plans, drinks with friends, fitness classes, even solo movie nights I'd mentioned in passing. More disturbing was what happened when I experimented with boundaries. When I didn't respond immediately to non-urgent texts, his messages escalated rapidly from casual to frantic. When I mentioned plans with friends, he'd initially seem supportive, then find subtle ways to make me feel guilty for leaving him alone. When I spoke about work ambitions, he'd express enthusiasm that quickly morphed into anxiety about how changes would affect our dynamic. The pattern extended beyond our direct interactions. Mutual colleagues began making odd comments, expressions of concern about my emotional stability based on things Alex had apparently shared, questions about whether I was doing okay, with thinly veiled implications that I might be struggling mentally. Invitations that stopped coming because Alex had told people I was going through a lot right now and needed space, statements I'd never made. He was isolating me just as he'd isolated Stephanie, creating a narrative about my mental state that made others view me through a lens of concern rather than normalcy, subtly positioning himself as my caretaker rather than the reverse, ensuring that if I ever spoke about the reality of our relationship, my perspective would be questioned. The most damning evidence came 6 weeks after meeting Stephanie. I deliberately didn't tell Alex about an important interview for a senior editing position at a prestigious publishing house, a significant career advancement. The morning of the interview, barely an hour before I needed to leave, Alex called in hysterics. His father had suffered a heart attack. He needed me immediately, could barely function, didn't know what to do. I rushed to his apartment, canceling the interview en route, found him distraught, packing, seemingly unable to make basic decisions about packing or travel arrangements. I spent hours helping him book flights, pack appropriate clothes, arrange for time off work, called his mother for details about his father's condition, only to hear confusion in her voice. Yes, his father had gone to the hospital for a routine colonoscopy. No heart attack, no emergency, no reason for panic. The deliberate manipulation left me cold. Alex had lied, not just exaggerated or catastrophized, but completely fabricated a medical emergency to prevent me from attending a job interview he shouldn't have even known about. When confronted with this reality, his response followed a now predictable pattern. Initial denial, then minimization, he misunderstood his mother's message. Then redirection, how could I focus on something so trivial when he was clearly in distress? Then attack, after everything he'd been through, after all the times he'd supported me, how could I be so selfish? Finally, when none of these tactics worked, collapse, uncontrollable sobbing, expressions of worthlessness, allusions to self-harm. The script was so precise it could have been lifted directly from the pages of Stephanie's journal. The realization solidified something in me. This wasn't love, friendship, or even codependency. It was something darker, a deliberate pattern of emotional manipulation designed to keep me tethered to his needs while systematically dismantling my independence. Yet knowing the truth didn't immediately free me. The hooks were in too deep, the fear too ingrained. What if he actually hurt himself? What if no one else was there for him? What if I was overreacting, misinterpreting, being unduly influenced by a bitter ex-girlfriend? The confrontation that might have severed the relationship in healthier circumstances only drove it underground. I didn't announce my withdrawal all at once. That would have triggered an extinction burst of crises I wasn't prepared to handle. Instead, I began a gradual, strategic retreat. Responses to non-emergency texts slowed from immediate to hourly. Availability for in-person support shifted from right away to later today to maybe tomorrow. Emotional labor decreased from active problem-solving to passive listening. Each small boundary triggered exactly the escalation Stephanie had predicted, confirming the manipulative nature of the dynamic. Alex sensed the change immediately. His tactics intensified, cycling through his arsenal of emotional weapons with increasing desperation. Manufactured emergencies multiplied. Suicide threats became more explicit. Claims about my deteriorating reputation at work grew more concerning. Mutual friends began reaching out with strange concerns, clearly planted by seeds he'd sown about my stability. The most difficult evidence to face wasn't about Alex at all. It was about myself. The unflattering truth of why I'd remained entangled long after the red flags became unmistakable. The uncomfortable recognition of my own savior complex. The validation I'd found in being needed so desperately. The way his dependence had filled some empty space in me that craved purpose, meaning, indispensability. This wasn't just about Alex's manipulation. It was about my willingness to be manipulated, my complicity in the dynamic, the secondary gains I'd received from sacrificing my needs for his insatiable emotional demands. The identity I'd built around being his rock, his savior, his emotional caretaker. The hardest confrontation wasn't with Alex, it was with myself. The recognition that I'd enabled the very behaviors that were destroying my life, that I'd chosen this role, maintained it, defended it against the concerns of people who genuinely cared about me, that some broken part of me had found comfort in the dysfunction. 14 months after that first night in the break room, I found myself sitting in my therapist's office, a step I'd finally taken at Stephanie's urging. The walls were covered with degrees and certifications, the bookshelf lined with psychology texts, the space designed for exactly the kind of professional support I should have directed Alex toward instead of trying to provide it myself. My therapist's assessment was gentle but unequivocal. The relationship with Alex demonstrated classic emotional abuse patterns. My gradual exhaustion, isolation, and anxiety weren't character flaws or failure of compassion. They were normal responses to abnormal levels of emotional manipulation. The guilt I felt about setting boundaries wasn't an accurate moral compass, but a programmed response installed through months of conditioning. Most importantly, she confirmed what Stephanie had tried to tell me. I wasn't responsible for Alex's emotional stability. His threats of self-harm weren't my burden to carry. His well-being wasn't my life's purpose. My responsibility was to myself first, my health, my goals, my relationships, my future. The evidence was complete, the pattern undeniable, the cost calculable in lost opportunities, strained relationships, and declining mental health. The confrontation with reality could no longer be avoided. Alex wasn't going to change, the dynamic wouldn't improve, the situation wouldn't magically resolve itself. There was only one path forward, and it required something I'd avoided for over a year, prioritizing my needs over his demands, setting boundaries not as negotiable suggestions but as non-negotiable necessities, reclaiming my right to a life not dominated by someone else's perpetual crises. The night I finally set my first real boundary with Alex remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. After 16 months of being available at all hours, I informed him I wouldn't be answering texts after 10 p.m. unless it was a genuine emergency, a small, reasonable limit that any healthy person would respect. His response was immediate and disproportionate. Multiple messages questioning my commitment, accusations of abandonment, references to past supporters who had given up on him, thinly veiled allusions to self-harm, each text designed to hit my guilt triggers with surgical precision. I turned my phone off at 10:01 p.m., hands shaking, nausea rising in my throat. Spent the next hour packing my apartment, fighting the programmed urge to check on him, to make sure he was okay, to walk back my boundary to ease his distress. My body physically rebelled against the separation, heart racing, palms sweating, mind conjuring worst-case scenarios. When I turned my phone back on the next morning, there were 47 messages, a calculated escalation from concern to panic to despair to anger and back again. The final text, timestamped FA 13 a.m. I guess I finally see who you really are. The emotional toll of that single boundary enforcement left me drained for days, anxious, disoriented, questioning my own judgment. The disproportionate response made me feel simultaneously cruel for enforcing such a small limit and angry that something so basic had become a battleground. This pattern repeated with each boundary I established. A simple no to an unreasonable request triggered days of emotional aftermath, declining to cancel plans with family-prompted silent treatment followed by a manufactured crisis. Mentioning a potential job change unleashed accusations that I was abandoning him just when things were getting better. The emotional manipulation was effective precisely because it was partially true. I was pulling back. I was prioritizing other relationships and opportunities. I was untangling myself from his dependency. His distress at losing control was genuine, which made the guilt all the more potent. My therapist called this emotional hostage-taking, making me responsible for his psychological state, punishing any attempt at independence, creating consequences designed to make autonomy feel too costly. The fact that these tactics worked so effectively revealed how deeply the hooks were embedded. The fallout wasn't limited to our direct interactions. As I created more distance, Alex escalated his campaign to isolate me professionally and socially. Rumors circulated through the office about my fragile emotional state. Mutual friends approached with concerns about my erratic behavior, concerns traced directly back to Alex's misleading narratives. Most painfully, he began reaching out to my family members through social media, messages expressing worry about my well-being, suggestions that I was struggling with something but refusing help, positioning himself as the concerned friend rather than the source of my distress. My mother called, confusion and worry in her voice, asking why Alex thought I needed intervention. My brother texted asking if everything was okay, mentioning Alex had reached out with concerns. My cousin, who had only met Alex once, somehow received an elaborate message detailing his fears about my mental health. The isolation tactics were textbook but nonetheless effective. Explaining the reality of the situation made me sound paranoid, exactly as Alex had positioned me. Defending myself required revealing the embarrassing truth of how long I'd allowed the manipulation to continue. Silence meant allowing his narrative to stand unchallenged. I chose selective disclosure, told my immediate family enough to contextualize his concerns without revealing the full extent of the dysfunction, asked trusted colleagues to be skeptical of rumors about my stability, set my social media to private to limit his access to my network. These external battles, however difficult, were manageable compared to the internal fallout. The emotional aftermath of extracting myself from Alex's grip manifested in unexpected ways. Anxiety that persisted even when he wasn't texting. Hypervigilance about my phone. Guilt that surfaced randomly, triggered by innocuous situations. A persistent feeling that I was forgetting something critical, neglecting some essential responsibility. Most disturbing was the identity crisis that emerged as I created distance. Who was I when not serving as Alex's emotional support system? What defined me beyond my capacity to absorb someone else's pain? What would fill the hours previously consumed by his crises? I'd built so much of my self-concept around being needed, being exceptional, irreplaceable, uniquely capable of handling what others couldn't. Removing that role left a vacuum. The constant emergency response had been exhausting but purposeful. The absence of crisis created an unsettling void. Sleep became elusive. Either anxiety kept me awake, waiting for the inevitable text signaling a new emergency, or exhaustion pulled me under into nightmares where I failed to save him from self-destruction. Even in unconsciousness, his needs dominated my psyche. Physical symptoms manifested alongside the psychological distress. Tension headaches that lasted for days, stomach issues that flared with each confrontation, weight loss from stress and forgotten meals, dark circles beneath my eyes that makeup couldn't conceal. Colleagues noticed the changes, comments about looking tired, questions about whether I was ill, concerned glances when I jumped at the sound of my phone. The irony wasn't lost on me. My efforts to extract myself from Alex's manipulation were creating exactly the appearance of instability he'd been describing to others. The cost extended beyond my health to concrete opportunities. A promotion passed over because I seemed distracted lately. A potential relationship that fizzled when I couldn't explain my constant anxiety without revealing more than I wanted to share. Family events experienced through a fog of hypervigilance, always waiting for the crisis text that would pull me away. My therapist explained these symptoms as normal responses to what was essentially an abusive relationship. The anxiety, hypervigilance, and identity confusion weren't signs of weakness but predictable reactions to prolonged emotional manipulation. The physical symptoms reflected the very real physiological impact of chronic stress. Most importantly, she helped me recognize that these reactions weren't evidence I was making the wrong choice. Quite the opposite, they confirmed the unhealthy nature of the dynamic with Alex. The severity of the fallout directly corresponded to the depth of the dysfunction. Healing would be painful precisely because the relationship had been so damaging. This framing helped but didn't eliminate the distress. Intellectual understanding rarely trumps emotional programming, especially when that programming has been deliberately installed to serve someone else's needs. The lowest point came approximately 18 months after that first night in the break room. After weeks of gradually reduced contact, I declined to meet Alex for our usual Friday coffee, the last regular in-person interaction I hadn't yet eliminated. His response was a 3 a.m. appearance at my apartment door, pounding, shouting, demanding to know if I was okay, creating enough disturbance that a neighbor called the building manager. I didn't open the door, didn't respond to his texts or calls, sat in my darkened bedroom, phone in hand, 911 pre-dialed but not yet sent, listened to his voice escalate from concern to anger to tearful pleading. The performance designed for multiple audiences, me obviously, but also my neighbors, the building manager, anyone who might pressure me to respond out of concern or annoyance. When he finally left after the building manager threatened to call police, I broke down. Not from fear, though that was present, but from the crushing weight of responsibility that still clung to me despite months of therapy and boundary setting. The unshakable feeling that his well-being remained my burden, that walking away made me the monster he was now claiming I was. That night marked both the lowest point and the turning point. The next morning, with my therapist on an emergency call, I finally took the step I'd been avoiding. I contacted campus security at our workplace, detailed the escalating behavior without dramatics, requested they be aware of the situation without specifying any action, created a record just in case. The emotional fallout of that single act of self-protection was seismic. Guilt so intense it manifested as physical pain, fear that I'd overreacted, that I'd damaged his reputation unfairly, conflicting certainty that I'd underreacted, that I should have reported the behavior months earlier, shame at having allowed the situation to progress this far, relief at having finally drawn a clear, enforceable line. The security officer's matter-of-fact response was unexpectedly healing. This wasn't the first such report she'd taken. The pattern I described was familiar. My reactions were normal, my concerns were valid, my boundaries were reasonable. Simple validation from an objective third party provided more relief than months of internal struggle. That validation created space for anger to finally emerge, not the fleeting irritation I'd felt at individual manipulations, but deep, clarifying fury at the entirety of what had happened. Anger at Alex for his calculated exploitation of my compassion. Anger at myself for allowing it to continue despite increasingly obvious signs. Anger at the social conditioning that had taught me my needs were secondary to others' comfort. Anger at the time, opportunities, and peace I'd sacrificed to someone who saw me as a resource rather than a person. The anger burned clean, cauterized wounds that guilt had kept open, cleared cobwebs of confusion that had obscured the simple truth. I had the right to my own life. My time was mine to allocate. My energy was mine to direct. My boundaries weren't suggestions to be negotiated, but fundamental expressions of selfhood to be respected. With that clarity came grief, mourning for the person I'd thought Alex was, for the friendship I'd believed we had, for the genuine support I'd offered before recognizing the manipulation, for the parts of myself I'd neglected while tending to his perpetual crises, for the opportunities missed, the relationship strained, the peace sacrificed. Most poignantly, I grieved for my own naivety, the belief that I could fix someone else's brokenness through sheer force of will and unlimited availability, the assumption that sacrifice equated to virtue, the magical thinking that had convinced me I was somehow exceptional, uniquely equipped to succeed where others had failed. This grief wasn't linear. It came in waves, receded, returned when triggered by songs or places or phrases that reminded me of the situation. Sometimes it appeared as sadness, sometimes as emptiness, sometimes as unexpected tears while performing mundane tasks. My therapist normalized this grief, explained that ending any significant relationship, even an unhealthy one, involves loss. The greater the investment, the more intense the grief. The manipulation made the process more complicated but no less necessary. Gradually, painfully, life began to rebalance. Sleep came easier. The persistent anxiety receded to manageable levels. Physical symptoms subsided as the chronic stress decreased. I re-engaged with friends who had been pushed to the periphery during my entanglement with Alex. reconnected with family without the undercurrent of dread that a crisis text would interrupt our time together. Work performance improved as I regained focus and emotional energy. The creative projects I'd abandoned, including the novel that had been on indefinite hold, slowly resumed. Small pleasures returned, uninterrupted movies, books finished in a single sitting, mornings without immediately checking my phone for overnight emergencies. The most significant shift wasn't external but internal. The gradual recognition that my worth wasn't tied to being needed, that boundaries weren't selfish but necessary, that my primary responsibility was to my own well-being, not someone else's emotional state, that true compassion didn't mean endless sacrifice but appropriate support that empowered rather than enabled. These realizations didn't arrive in a single epiphany but accumulated through small moments of clarity. The first time I declined a request without immediate guilt. The evening I realized hours had passed without thinking about Alex. The morning I woke without immediately checking my phone. The day I received a promotion at work and celebrated without a shadow of anxiety about how he would respond. Progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, days when the old patterns reasserted themselves, moments when a text from an unknown number triggered instant panic, situations where I caught myself over-explaining a simple no, anticipating manipulation that wasn't coming from someone who wasn't Alex. The emotional aftermath continued long after the active crisis had passed. Hypervigilance lingered, trust in others and in my own judgment rebuilt slowly. The tendency to assume responsibility for others' feelings required constant awareness and correction. But beneath these ongoing challenges, something fundamental had shifted. The emotional foundation had stabilized. The constant emergency response had deactivated. The caretaking compulsion had quieted. The boundaries had solidified. I was reclaiming myself piece by piece, day by day, not returning to who I'd been before Alex. That person no longer existed, but becoming someone new, someone more aware of manipulation tactics, someone more conscious of my own needs and limits, someone who understood that true compassion included self-compassion. The emotional fallout of those 18 months with Alex changed me permanently, left scars that would always be part of my story, created vulnerabilities that would require ongoing awareness, but also built strengths, insights, and boundaries that would protect me from similar exploitation in the future. I was different, wounded but healing, wiser but not cynical, more cautious but not closed. The emotional aftermath wasn't just pain to be endured but transformation to be integrated. Not just what had been lost, but what had been found through the process of reclaiming my life from someone who had never had the right to claim it. There's a moment in every toxic relationship when something irreversible happens. A line crossed that can't be uncrossed, a revelation so clear it can't be unseen. The instant when all the scattered pieces suddenly form a pattern so obvious you wonder how you ever missed it. For me, that moment came 22 months after that first night in the break room, not dramatically, not with screaming or broken glass or theatrical declarations. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening in October, with autumn rain tapping against my apartment windows and a half-empty cup of tea cooling on my coffee table. I'd been maintaining strategic distance from Alex for months, reduced contact to minimal professional interaction, stopped responding to non-emergency texts, declined invitations to coffee or lunch, created the space my therapist had encouraged, allowing my nervous system to recalibrate without constant triggering. The campaign of isolation he'd launched in response had largely run its course. Some colleagues and acquaintances had accepted his narrative about my instability and withdrawn. Others had recognized the manipulation and maintained connection. My closest friends and family had never fully bought his concerned act. The social aftermath had been painful but survivable. Work had stabilized. I'd earned that promotion I'd once missed due to his manufactured emergency. My creative projects had resumed. My health had improved. The constant anxiety had receded to occasional discomfort. Progress, healing, slow but steady movement toward a life reclaimed. That Tuesday, I was working on my novel, the one I'd abandoned during the worst of my entanglement with Alex, lost in the flow of creativity for the first time in months, fully present, fully engaged, mind quiet except for the story unfolding through my fingers. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, Alex's name on the screen. My body responded before my mind could intervene, heart racing, stomach dropping, muscles tensing, Pavlovian reactions to a stimulus that had consistently preceded emotional labor. I didn't open the message immediately, took 3 deep breaths, reminded myself of the boundaries I'd established, prepared for the usual manipulation tactics, emergency claims, guilt triggers, veiled threats. The message was none of those things, just 4 words: I miss my friend. Simple, direct, vulnerable in a way his communications rarely were. No obvious manipulation, no explicit demand, just a statement of feeling that bypassed my defenses precisely because of its apparent innocence. My fingers hovered over the screen. The muscle memory of caretaking urged an immediate response. The boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish counseled caution. The progress of recent months demanded protection. I set the phone down, returned to my writing, tried to recapture the flow that had been interrupted. Failed. The message had planted itself in my consciousness, germinating questions and doubts. Had I overreacted to the whole situation? Had Alex genuinely changed? Was I being unnecessarily cruel by maintaining such rigid boundaries? After 20 minutes of distraction, I picked up the phone again. Reread the message. 4 words, 12 letters. A precision-guided emotional missile that had found its target despite all my defenses. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Whatever I sent would reopen communication, create expectations, potentially restart the cycle I'd worked so hard to escape. Eventually I settled on, "I hope you're doing well." Neutral, kind without being inviting, a human acknowledgement without an open door, the best compromise between compassion and self-protection I could manage. His response came immediately, as if he'd been waiting with phone in hand. "Can we talk, just for a few minutes? I'm in a better place now, getting help. I miss having you in my life." The speed and content confirmed what part of me already knew. The initial message hadn't been a casual thought, but a calculated opening. The beginning of a carefully planned campaign to reestablish connection. Still, the claim about getting help gave me pause. If true, it represented exactly what I'd always hoped for him, appropriate professional support rather than emotional dependency on friends. If genuine, perhaps some kind of healthy closure conversation could be possible. I agreed to a brief phone call the following evening. Set clear parameters, 15 minutes, no emergency discussions, strictly about current well-being and potential closure. Conditions that any truly healthy person would respect. The anticipatory anxiety that followed was intense. Sleep proved elusive that night. Work the next day passed in a distracted blur. By evening, I'd mentally rehearsed dozens of versions of the conversation, prepared responses for various manipulation attempts, established firm internal boundaries about what I would and wouldn't discuss. When my phone rang at the agreed time, I was as prepared as I could be, voice steady despite my racing heart, determined to maintain perspective despite the emotional undertow. The conversation began with exactly the tone I'd anticipated. Alex sounded calm, reflective, insightful, mentioned therapy, acknowledged past patterns, expressed appropriate regret without excessive self-flagellation, hit all the right notes of someone genuinely working on themselves. He talked about changes he'd made, medication that was helping, coping skills he'd developed, insights about his dependency patterns, progress that sounded genuine, significant, worthy of cautious optimism. For the first 10 minutes, I found myself relaxing into the conversation, feeling a tentative sense of closure, relief that he seemed to be addressing his issues appropriately, pride even that I'd maintained boundaries firmly enough to necessitate this growth. Then came the pivot, so subtle I almost missed it, a casual mention of a work opportunity he'd heard about, an editing position at a prestigious literary journal, a position I'd applied for weeks earlier but hadn't discussed with anyone at Meridian. "You'd be perfect for it," he said, voice warm with apparent support. "Have you considered applying?" The question landed like ice water. How did he know about this opportunity? I hadn't mentioned it to mutual colleagues, hadn't updated my professional social media, hadn't discussed it with anyone except my closest friend and my therapist. Before I could formulate a response, he continued, "Though the timing might be challenging with your family situation right now, how is your mom doing after the surgery?" My mother hadn't had surgery, wasn't scheduled for surgery, had no health issues requiring surgical intervention. In that moment, everything crystallized with terrifying clarity. Alex hadn't changed. He was still monitoring my life, still gathering information to use in manipulation. The apparent growth, the therapy claims, the medication mentions, all part of an elaborate performance designed to regain access. The most disturbing realization wasn't about his continued manipulation, but about the source of his information. The job opportunity could have been a lucky guess or office gossip, but the fabricated detail about my mother's non-existent surgery pointed to only one possible source, my cousin Emma, who I'd recently reconnected with after years of distance. Emma and I had been close as children, grown apart in adolescence, and recently begun rebuilding our relationship through occasional dinners and text exchanges. She didn't know Alex well, had met him briefly at a work function months earlier, had no reason to be in contact with him now that he and I had minimal interaction. Yet somehow he'd established a connection with her, created enough trust to extract information about my life, even implanted false information she'd apparently accepted without question, given my mother's actual excellent health. The realization hit with such force that I nearly dropped the phone. Alex hadn't just been manipulating me, expanded his operation to include my extended family, was using my cousin as an unwitting informant, had likely established similar connections with other peripheral figures in my life. The elaborate nature of the deception, the calculated patience it required, the meticulous attention to relationship building with people solely because of their connection to me, these spoke to something far beyond neediness or insecurity, something deliberate, strategic, predatory. In that moment, something broke permanently in my perception of Alex, not just as someone with issues I couldn't fix, but as someone actively dangerous to my well-being, not just emotionally draining but deliberately harmful, not just boundary challenged but predatory in a way I'd been minimizing for nearly 2 years. My voice remained steady somehow as I ended the call, made an excuse about another commitment, promised to be in touch soon, a lie I didn't feel guilty about in the context of his much larger deceptions. The moment the call ended, I texted Emma, asked directly if she'd been in contact with Alex. Her response confirmed everything. She'd run into him at a coffee shop near her apartment a few weeks earlier. He'd been warm, concerned about me, mentioned being worried I was isolating myself during a difficult time. They'd exchanged numbers, had met for coffee twice since. He'd been so supportive, so concerned, suggesting ways she could help me through my mother's recovery. I called her immediately, explained the situation as calmly as I could. The manipulation, the fabricated medical emergency, the pattern of isolation tactics, the reality of my mother's perfect health. Her shock and confusion quickly transformed to anger as the magnitude of the deception became clear. That night became a turning point beyond just my relationship with Alex. I systematically contacted everyone in my extended circle, family members, distant friends, professional acquaintances, asked directly if Alex had reached out to them. Discovered 7 separate relationships he'd established, each built on fabricated concerns about my well-being, each designed to gather information and potentially isolate me from support. The scale of the operation stunned me, the patience it required, the calculated relationship building with people who meant nothing to him except as sources of information about me, the elaborate false narratives tailored to each relationship, designed to elicit both concern and specific details about my life. This wasn't impulsive neediness, this was strategic, deliberate, predatory in a way I couldn't minimize or excuse, couldn't attribute to mental health struggles or attachment issues or unresolved trauma. This was something fundamentally different from what I'd been telling myself for nearly 2 years. That night I finally took the step I'd been avoiding for months, contacted HR at Meridian, requested a formal meeting, documented the pattern of behavior including the recent discoveries about his contact with my extended circle, provided text messages, timestamps, witness statements from my cousin and others he'd approached under false pretenses. The HR meeting itself was both better and worse than I'd anticipated. Better because they took the situation seriously, had in fact received similar reports from 2 other employees in the past 18 months. Worse because those reports hadn't resulted in any meaningful action due to insufficient documentation and the employees' eventual departures from the company. My case was different, my documentation was meticulous, my position at the company was secure, my boundaries were non-negotiable, the outcome was swift. Alex would be transferred to another department, prohibited from direct contact with me, required to attend counseling as a condition of continued employment, monitored for any sign of continued boundary violations. It wasn't everything I wanted. True safety would have required his complete removal from the company, but it was sufficient to establish clear, enforceable professional boundaries, to create a record that any future employer could access, to demonstrate that his behavior had consequences beyond just the loss of access to me. The aftermath of that HR meeting transformed something fundamental in my recovery, the external validation from authority figures, the realization that others had experienced similar patterns from Alex, the knowledge that my perception hadn't been distorted by overreaction or misinterpretation. Most importantly, the situation stripped away the last vestiges of misplaced responsibility I'd been carrying, the final lingering belief that if I'd just been stronger, smarter, more compassionate, things might have turned out differently. The evidence was irrefutable. Alex's behavior wasn't about my responses, but about his deliberate choices. Wasn't triggered by my boundaries, but by his calculated efforts to circumvent them. That clarity catalyzed the final phase of my extraction from his influence. I changed my phone number, restricted my social media to close trusted contacts, informed my extended network about the situation without dramatizing or demonizing, just facts, boundaries, requests for awareness. 3 years have passed since that night in the break room when I first crossed the boundary from coworker to emotional caretaker. 2 years since my meeting with Stephanie revealed the pattern I'd become entangled in. 1 year since the phone call that finally shattered any illusions about who Alex truly was. The immediate crisis has long since passed, the active manipulation has ended, the day-to-day anxiety has subsided, yet the long-term consequences of those 24 months remain etched into my psyche, my relationships, my approach to the world, persistent aftershocks from an earthquake that has technically ended. The most visible consequence is professional. 6 months after the HR intervention, I left Meridian Publishing entirely. Not because of continued issues with Alex, the boundaries established had been effective, but because the environment itself had become tainted. Every meeting room held memories of panic texts received. Every break room conversation carried undertones of who might be reporting back to him. Every interaction with certain colleagues was colored by knowledge of whose side they'd taken during the worst of it. Starting over professionally at 30 was never my plan. Abandoning 5 years of networking, relationship building, and career advancement at a respected publishing house wasn't a trivial decision. Yet the cost of staying, the hypervigilance, the constant management of mutual connections, the energy diverted to maintaining emotional safety, ultimately outweighed the benefits of the familiar. The new position at Archer Literary brought higher pay, more responsibility, and a fresh environment untouched by Alex's influence. But it also meant rebuilding professional reputation from the ground up, proving myself again, establishing trust with new colleagues who hadn't witnessed my competence over years, re-earning credibility that had been automatic at Meridian. This professional consequence came with unexpected costs and benefits, the cost of starting over, of course. The benefit of recognition that I could start over, that my value wasn't tied to any specific company or position, that my skills were transferable, my contribution meaningful in new contexts, that I wasn't trapped, professionally or personally, by the choices I'd made regarding Alex. The interpersonal consequences have been more complex, less visible, but equally significant. The experience fundamentally rewired my approach to relationship formation. Not in the stereotypical can't trust anyone sense, I've fought hard against that particular trauma response, but in a more nuanced recalibration of boundaries, expectations, and warning signs. I notice things now that once would have slipped past without registration. The subtle testing of limits in early friendship stages, the disproportionate reactions to minor boundary assertions, the timing of crises that mysteriously align with important events in my life, the gradual isolation tactics that begin with reasonable-sounding concern. This heightened awareness is both protective and exhausting. It prevents similar entanglements but sometimes casts shadows on innocent interactions, creates safety but occasionally at the cost of spontaneity, maintains boundaries but sometimes builds walls higher than necessary. My therapist calls this the security system effect, the inevitable trade-off between protection and accessibility. A necessary recalibration after significant boundary violations, but one that requires ongoing adjustment to avoid either dangerous vulnerability or isolating hypervigilance. Finding that balance has been the work of months, years, learning to trust my instincts without being ruled by past trauma, establishing boundaries without isolating myself, remaining open to genuine connection while maintaining protective awareness. The most painful long-term consequences have manifested in my closest relationships, not because those relationships have suffered, quite the opposite. My connections with family, close friends, and eventually romantic partners have deepened precisely because of what happened with Alex. The painful part is recognizing how much those relationships suffered during my entanglement with him, how much I missed, how much I sacrificed to someone who saw me as a resource rather than a person. My mother's 60th birthday celebration, attended with only half my attention, constantly checking my phone for crisis texts. My best friend's pregnancy announcement, received with distracted congratulations because Alex was in the midst of another emotional meltdown. My brother's job promotion, acknowledged but not properly celebrated because I was emotionally depleted from hours of late-night support texts. These moments can't be reclaimed, these memories can't be rewritten, these experiences can't be redone with proper presence and attention. The time and emotional energy diverted to Alex's manufactured crises represent a permanent loss, opportunities and connections that slipped away while I was tending to his insatiable needs. This recognition brings grief that surfaces in unexpected moments. A family photo taken during those 2 years, my smile tight, my eyes checking the time, knowing my phone might buzz at any moment. A journal entry from that period, filled with anxiety about Alex's latest crisis rather than reflections on my own life. A social media memory showing a gathering I left early because he needed immediate support for a non-emergency. These artifacts from that period serve as reminders of what emotional manipulation truly costs, not just in the moment, but in the accumulation of moments. Not just in obvious conflict, but in subtle diversion of attention and energy from what actually matters. The financial consequences, while less emotionally charged, are nonetheless significant. Therapy sessions at $175 weekly for over 2 years. The salary differential between what I earned at Meridian and what I might have made had I pursued opportunities I canceled due to Alex's emergencies. The apartment security upgrades installed after discovering the extent of his information-gathering network. The legal consultation regarding potential restraining orders. The career coach hired to help navigate the professional transition after leaving Meridian. The total runs into tens of thousands of dollars, tangible evidence of intangible harm, a concrete measurement of what emotional manipulation costs not just psychologically, but practically. Perhaps the most profound long-term consequence has been the transformation of my relationship with myself. The recognition of my own vulnerability to certain manipulation tactics, the uncomfortable acknowledgement of what needs in me Alex exploited so effectively, the ongoing work of addressing those vulnerabilities without self-blame or shame. My therapist framed this process not as fixing something broken, but as understanding something human. Everyone has emotional needs, she explained. Everyone has vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who recognize them. The issue wasn't that I had needs for meaning, purpose, and specialness. The issue was that Alex deliberately targeted and exploited those normal human desires. This reframing helped shift my self-perception from foolish victim who should have known better to normal person targeted by someone skilled at emotional manipulation. Not to absolve myself of responsibility for my choices, but to contextualize them within a pattern of deliberate exploitation. The long-term work hasn't been eliminating these normal human needs, but developing healthier ways to meet them. Finding purpose and meaning in balanced relationships and meaningful work rather than constant crisis management. Experiencing specialness in reciprocal connections rather than one-sided caretaking. Building identity around multifaceted strengths rather than martyred self-sacrifice. This internal recalibration has been the most challenging and rewarding consequence of the entire experience. The development of a more grounded, authentic sense of self, a clearer understanding of my own boundaries, needs, and worth, a more balanced approach to relationships that prioritizes reciprocity over rescue. The romantic consequences emerged gradually as I began dating again. The initial hypervigilance against potential manipulation, the reflexive anxiety when a new partner needed emotional support, the careful analysis of patterns that might indicate unhealthy dependency. These reactions weren't inappropriate given what I'd experienced, but they required conscious management to prevent past trauma from contaminating new connections. The careful explanation to new partners about why certain behaviors might trigger disproportionate responses, the ongoing communication about boundaries and needs, the deliberate effort to remain open despite the risk of being hurt again. 2 years after extracting myself from Alex's manipulation, I met Daniel, a landscape architect with kind eyes and intuitive understanding of personal space. Our relationship developed slowly, cautiously on my part. Each minor conflict, each emotional need expressed, each boundary tested became an opportunity for me to practice new patterns rather than falling into old ones. The first time Daniel experienced a genuine crisis, his father hospitalized unexpectedly, my internal response system went haywire. Caretaking instincts activated instantly, ready to drop everything and become his emotional support system. Simultaneously, alarm bells rang warning of potential manipulation, nodding the timing just before an important work event. Navigating that moment required everything I'd learned in therapy, differentiating between genuine need and manipulative demand, providing appropriate support without sacrificing my own well-being, maintaining perspective about the difference between this situation and my history with Alex. The fact that Daniel never once expected me to cancel my work commitment encouraged me to maintain my routine while offering updates by text and expressed gratitude for limited support rather than demanding unlimited availability. These healthy responses highlighted through contrast just how abnormal Alex's expectations had been. That relationship with Daniel eventually ended for unrelated reasons, but it served as important evidence that I could establish healthy connections despite past exploitation. that my capacity for appropriate caregiving remained intact, that my trauma responses were manageable with awareness and communication. The social consequences extended beyond immediate relationships to my broader approach to community. The experience with Alex, particularly discovering his extensive information gathering network, created a heightened awareness of how seemingly separate social spheres connect, how information travels through mutual acquaintances, how isolated actions can create ripple effects through extended networks. This awareness led to more intentional management of social boundaries, more careful consideration of information sharing, more deliberate cultivation of separate social spheres rather than the overlapping networks I'd previously maintained without much thought. Not isolation but compartmentalization, not paranoia but prudence, not withdrawal but strategic engagement, a recognition that privacy isn't selfishness but self-protection, that information is currency that should be spent mindfully, that social connections can be weaponized by those with manipulative intent. The most unexpected long-term consequence has been the development of a strange kind of gratitude for the experience, not for Alex or his actions, but for what the ordeal revealed about myself and others, for the clarity it forced about my own needs and boundaries, for the strength discovered through recovery, for the deeper connections formed with those who supported me throughout. This gratitude doesn't negate the harm done or excuse the manipulation. It simply acknowledges that surviving something difficult can create growth that might not have occurred otherwise, that being broken open, while painful, sometimes allows for rebuilding something stronger. 3 years later, the consequences of those 24 months with Alex remain, not as active wounds but as healed scars, not as debilitating limitations but as informative experiences, not as defining trauma but as one chapter in a much longer story. I'm not who I was before Alex, that person naive about certain forms of manipulation, unclear about certain boundaries, vulnerable to certain exploitation tactics no longer exists, but neither am I defined solely by what happened with him. The long-term consequences are part of me now, integrated into a more complex, resilient, self-aware identity. The hypervigilance has softened into reasonable caution. The self-doubt has evolved into thoughtful reflection. The isolation tactics he attempted have been countered by deeper, more authentic connections with those who truly matter. Perhaps the most meaningful long-term consequence is the capacity to recognize my experience in others, to notice the subtle signs of emotional manipulation in friends' relationships, to offer perspective without judgment, to share what I've learned without insisting everyone learn it the same way. Not evangelizing from trauma, but translating it into something useful, not defined by what happened, but informed by it, not trapped in the past, but carrying its lessons forward into a future that feels, despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, more authentically mine than it ever was during those months when my life revolved around someone else's perpetual crises. 5 years have passed since that first night in the break room. 5 years since I gave my phone number to a coworker in crisis, not understanding how completely that single act of compassion would reshape my life. 3 years since I finally extracted myself from the toxic dependency that grew from that moment. 2 years since I last heard Alex's voice or saw his name appear on my phone screen. The current state of things is both simpler and more complex than I would have predicted during the worst of it. Simpler because the active crisis has long since passed, more complex because its echoes still reverberate through my life in ways both obvious and subtle. Professionally, I've flourished at Archer Literary. The senior editor position I took after leaving Meridian has evolved into editorial director, overseeing our most prestigious imprints. The novel I abandoned during my entanglement with Alex has been completed, sold, and published to modest but respectable reviews. My professional reputation has been rebuilt, stronger than before, untainted by the whisper network Alex once cultivated about my stability and reliability. This professional success feels particularly meaningful given how deliberately Alex's manufactured crises targeted my career advancement. The job interviews interrupted by false emergencies. The networking events missed due to his emotional meltdowns. The creative energy diverted to crisis management rather than my own projects. Reclaiming this aspect of my life represents not just personal achievement, but a specific rejection of the limitations his manipulation attempted to impose. The most visible evidence of this reclamation sits on my office bookshelf, my novel, spine out, my name embossed in simple typography. Whenever self-doubt creeps in, whenever the old patterns of thought resurface, that physical artifact stands as tangible proof that his efforts to diminish me ultimately failed. Personally, the current state is more nuanced. The hypervigilance that characterized the first year after extraction has largely subsided. The anxiety that once spiked at every unexpected text message has dulled to occasional wariness. The reflexive guilt when establishing boundaries has transformed into appropriate assertion of needs. Progress, undeniable progress, but not without remaining sensitivity. My relationship patterns have stabilized into something healthier than before Alex, but still bearing the imprint of that experience. I notice manipulation tactics with hair-trigger awareness. Establish boundaries with careful deliberation rather than intuitive fluidity. Assess new relationships with a thoroughness that occasionally borders on excessive caution. This isn't entirely negative. The unhealthy patterns I once accepted without question now register immediately. The red flags I once dismissed as personality quirks now demand appropriate attention. The imbalanced dynamics I once normalized now seem obviously unsustainable. I'm harder to manipulate, more aware of my own needs, clearer about my non-negotiable boundaries. But there's a cost to this heightened awareness, a subtle filter through which all relationships now pass. A background process running constantly, evaluating interactions for signs of the patterns Alex established. An extra layer of processing that sometimes delays natural connection or spontaneous vulnerability. My therapist describes this as a normal adaptation after significant boundary violations, a security system installed by the psyche to prevent similar harm. Not pathological but protective, not permanent but persistent, not something to eliminate entirely but something to refine over time, adjusting its sensitivity to allow closeness without dangerous vulnerability. 2 years ago, I began dating Michael, a curriculum developer I met through a mutual friend. The relationship has grown slowly, deliberately, with conscious attention to the patterns I recognize from my experience with Alex. Michael knows the broad outlines of what happened, not every detail, but enough to understand certain responses that might otherwise seem disproportionate. His own relationship history includes manipulation from a former partner, creating a shared language around boundaries and red flags that feels both validating and normalizing. We joke sometimes about our matching trauma responses, not with bitterness, but with the dark humor of survivors who recognize themselves in each other. The relationship isn't defined by our past experiences, but it is informed by them. The deliberate communication about needs and boundaries, the conscious attention to reciprocity, the mutual recognition of healing as ongoing rather than completed. These elements create a connection that feels more solid, more intentional, more authentic than what I experienced before Alex reconfigured my understanding of relationship dynamics. Socially, my current state reflects both contraction and expansion. The friend circle that scattered during Alex's isolation campaign has partially reformed, with some connections permanently lost and others strengthened through the experience. New friendships have formed through work, through writing groups, through the ordinary processes of adult social formation. The quality of these connections feels different, deeper with some, more boundaried with others, less automatic trust, more earned confidence, less reflexive availability, more intentional engagement, less fear of judgment, more comfort with appropriate distance where needed. My family relationships have deepened precisely because of what happened with Alex. The contrast between his manipulative concern and their genuine support highlighted what actual care looks like. The experience of being believed and supported during the extraction process strengthened bonds that had sometimes felt obligatory rather than chosen. My mother, who once worried I was becoming too isolated during my entanglement with Alex, now speaks with pride about my resilience. My brother, who witnessed one of Alex's more dramatic performances when he visited during the worst period, now uses that experience as a reference point for identifying manipulation in his own social circles. My cousin Emma, who Alex attempted to use as an unwitting informant, has become one of my closest confidants, our relationship strengthened by weathering that deliberate interference. The most complex current state exists in the professional overlap that remains despite my departure from Meridian. The publishing industry in our city is relatively small, with frequent cross-company events, shared contacts, and inevitable encounters with former colleagues. These interactions sometimes include people who were part of Alex's information network, who believed his narrative about my instability, who participated knowingly or unknowingly in the isolation tactics he deployed. Navigating these encounters requires a careful balance of professional poise and personal boundaries, polite but distant interactions with those who actively participated in the manipulation, warmer but still cautious engagement with those who were simply misled, full professional collaboration with those who recognized the pattern or supported me throughout. This compartmentalized approach isn't about punishment or grudges but about appropriate trust calibration. Some bridges were burned beyond repair, some were damaged but reparable, some remained intact despite deliberate attempts to destroy them. Recognizing these distinctions isn't dwelling in the past but making informed decisions about the present. Alex himself remains at Meridian, though in a different department than when I left. Our paths occasionally cross at industry events, silent acknowledgments, careful distance maintained, professional facades intact. No dramatic confrontations, no public reckonings, no cinematic closure. Just the quiet recognition of a chapter closed, a lesson learned, a boundary established and maintained. I've heard through the inevitable industry grapevine that he's found a new emotional support person, a junior editor recently hired, already showing signs of the same pattern I experienced. The familiar cycle of late-night texts, manufactured emergencies, gradual isolation from colleagues, the same script performed with a new cast member. This knowledge brings complicated feelings: concern for someone walking unknowingly into the same trap that caught me, frustration that the pattern continues despite institutional awareness, relief that it's no longer my responsibility to manage or mitigate, the uncomfortable recognition that some people don't change their behaviors until the consequences outweigh the benefits, and sometimes not even then. I considered warning her once early in the pattern's emergence, drafted an email outlining what I'd experienced, what signs to watch for, what boundaries to establish early, never sent it. Recognized that unsolicited advice from a stranger about a colleague would likely backfire, potentially reinforcing whatever narrative Alex had already established about me. Instead, I've made myself quietly available if she ever reaches out, as Stephanie once did for me, as Melissa and Jard eventually did for each other. Not inserting myself unasked into someone else's experience, but creating space for connection if it becomes necessary. Not taking responsibility for preventing Alex's behavior, but offering perspective if it's ever sought. The most significant aspect of my current state exists internally rather than externally. The way I relate to myself has transformed, not just returned to what existed before Alex, but evolved into something more grounded, more compassionate, more authentically aligned with my actual values rather than performative caretaking. I recognize now how much of my identity was built around being needed, how much validation I derived from being the exceptional friend, the reliable support, the person who could handle what others couldn't. How that need created vulnerability to exactly the kind of manipulation Alex deployed, how that pattern predated him, making me particularly susceptible to his specific tactics. This recognition isn't self-blame but self-awareness. Not beating myself up for past vulnerability, but understanding its roots to prevent future exploitation. Not denying the genuine compassion that motivated my support, but acknowledging the unhealthy patterns that extended it beyond reasonable boundaries. My therapist calls this differentiation of self, the capacity to maintain clear boundaries while remaining connected, to offer support without becoming enmeshed, to care deeply without taking responsibility for others' emotions, to remain grounded in my own experience while empathizing with others. This ongoing process represents the most profound transformation of the entire experience, not just healing from specific trauma, but evolving beyond the patterns that enabled it. The current state includes persistent triggers, of course. Certain phrases that echo Alex's manipulation tactics, particular emotional expressions that mirror his calculated displays, specific relationship dynamics that parallel what developed between us. These triggers don't debilitate me anymore, but they do register: brief spikes of recognition, momentary activations of old neural pathways, fleeting impulses toward caretaking or withdrawal. The difference now is response rather than reaction, the capacity to notice these triggers without being controlled by them, to feel the emotional activation without acting from it, to use the information without being governed by the fear, to recognize patterns without assuming all situations that share certain elements will follow identical trajectories. This internal freedom feels like the most meaningful measure of healing, not the absence of triggers but the changed relationship to them, not forgetting what happened but integrating it into a larger narrative that doesn't center Alex or his manipulation, not defining myself by that experience but allowing it to inform a more conscious, intentional approach to relationship formation. 5 years after that first night in the break room, I am neither defined by what happened with Alex nor untouched by it. The experience has been metabolized, transformed from active trauma to integrated wisdom, from defining narrative to informative chapter, from consuming present to influential past. The current state isn't perfect healing or complete resolution. There are still moments of doubt, flashes of old patterns, echoes of past pain, but these moments exist alongside genuine connection, authentic joy, appropriate trust, and healthy boundaries, not either or but both and. Not complete recovery or ongoing victimhood, but the complex reality that exists between these oversimplified extremes. Perhaps the most accurate description of the current state is this: I am the author of my own story again, no longer a supporting character in someone else's narrative, no longer defined primarily by my capacity to absorb another's pain, no longer measuring my worth by my willingness to sacrifice boundaries for someone else's need. Just myself, scarred but healing, cautious but not closed, changed but not diminished, present in my own life in a way that wasn't possible when Alex's crises dominated my attention and energy. This ultimately is the current state, not perfect healing but authentic living, not absence of past influence but integration of its lessons, not who I was before Alex but who I've become through the process of reclaiming myself from the emotional manipulation that nearly consumed me. I still have the first text he ever sent me, I don't know how to make it through tonight, preserved in the backup archive of my old phone, not deleted but intentionally separated from my daily life, a digital artifact from a chapter that fundamentally changed me. Sometimes in moments of reflection, I reread our early exchanges, the desperate pleas that punctuated my nights, the constant crises that aligned suspiciously with my opportunities, the gradual expansion of what constituted emergency worthy of immediate response, the subtle shifts from gratitude to expectation to entitlement. Reading these messages now is like examining evidence from a crime scene after the case has been closed. The manipulation tactics so obvious in retrospect, the red flags practically glowing, the calculated escalations following a predictable pattern. Yet at the time, immersed in the moment, believing in my own exceptional capacity to help, I missed what now seems unmissable. This isn't self-recrimination. There's no benefit in harsh judgment of past choices made with limited information and genuine good intentions. It's simply acknowledgement of the gap between experience and understanding, how differently we perceive situations when we're in them versus when we've gained the perspective that only distance provides. If there's wisdom to be extracted from those 5 years, it's not the simplistic warning to avoid people with problems or never offer support during crisis. It's the more nuanced recognition that genuine care doesn't require unlimited access, that healthy support has boundaries, that sustainable compassion includes self-preservation, that true healing rarely comes from endless accommodation but from appropriate resources and professional intervention. The most persistent question throughout my recovery has been whether I could have recognized the manipulation earlier, whether there were signs I should have seen, patterns I should have identified, boundaries I should have established sooner, whether different choices on my part might have changed the outcome. My therapist finally reframed this unproductive line of questioning. The issue wasn't my failure to recognize manipulation tactics I'd never been taught to identify. The issue was Alex's deliberate choice to exploit normal human compassion for his own purposes. The responsibility lay not with my natural response to apparent need, but with his calculated targeting of that response. This reframing didn't absolve me of responsibility for my own choices, but it contextualized them within a pattern of deliberate exploitation. Located the primary problem not in my compassion, but in his manipulation, not in my desire to help, but in his intent to control. That distinction has been crucial to healing, separating genuine compassion from the unhealthy patterns it was channeled through, preserving the core value while adjusting its expression, maintaining the capacity to care deeply without sacrificing myself in the process. The lessons haven't been what I expected when I first began extracting myself from Alex's influence, not never trust again, but trust appropriately, not avoid all emotional investment, but invest wisely, not protect yourself at all costs, but establish boundaries that enable genuine connection rather than exploitation. These lessons haven't been easy to integrate. The pendulum swing from excessive vulnerability to rigid self-protection was inevitable, necessary even. The gradual return to center, maintaining appropriate boundaries while remaining open to authentic connection, has required consistent effort, ongoing awareness, deliberate choice. The process has transformed not just how I relate to others, but how I understand myself. The recognition of my own psychological blind spots, the awareness of which emotional needs made me vulnerable to specific manipulation tactics, the acceptance that some aspects of my identity were built around unhealthy caretaking rather than genuine self-expression. This self-knowledge isn't self-criticism but self-compassion, not beating myself up for past vulnerability, but understanding its roots to prevent future exploitation. Not denying the genuine care that motivated my support, but acknowledging the unhealthy patterns that extended it beyond reasonable boundaries. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome has been how this experience changed my relationship with my own emotions. Before Alex, I prided myself on emotional stability, the capacity to remain calm during others' crises, to absorb distress without becoming overwhelmed, to provide steady support regardless of circumstance. That stability was partly genuine strength but partly performative suppression. The denial of my own emotional needs in service of being the reliable one, the rock, the always available support system. The sublimation of my own distress to accommodate others' more dramatic expressions of pain. Alex's manipulation exploited that pattern perfectly, escalating demands that I ignore my needs to address his crises, leveraging my identity as the strong one to extract unlimited emotional labor, positioning any boundary enforcement as selfishness or abandonment. The healing process has required reclaiming my right to my own emotional experience, to acknowledge discomfort without apology, to express needs without guilt, to establish limits without justification, to recognize that my emotions deserve the same respect and attention I so readily offered to others. This shift hasn't made me less compassionate but more authentically so, not performing endless accommodation out of fear or obligation, but offering genuine support within sustainable boundaries. Not sacrificing my well-being on the altar of others' needs, but creating space where mutual care becomes possible. The practical implementation of these insights has transformed how I approach relationships at every level. The deliberate establishment of expectations early in connections, the clear communication about availability and boundaries, the recognition of red flags that once would have been dismissed as personality quirks or temporary stress responses. These changes aren't about becoming less caring, but about becoming more conscious about how that care is expressed. Not reflexively saying yes to every request, but thoughtfully considering what genuine support looks like in each situation. Not automatically sacrificing my needs when they conflict with others' wants, but seeking solutions that respect everyone involved. The most profound change has been internal rather than external. The quiet revolution of believing my experience matters as much as others. The radical act of trusting my perception when it conflicts with someone else's narrative. The fundamental shift from seeing boundaries as selfish to recognizing them as necessary for genuine connection. This evolution hasn't been linear or simple. There have been setbacks, moments of slipping into old patterns, instances of overcorrection toward isolation, periods of confusion about where appropriate boundaries lie. But the overall trajectory has been toward integration, balancing compassion with self-preservation, empathy with boundaries, connection with autonomy. The relationship with Alex, if it can even be called that, exists now only as memory and lesson. The active entanglement ended years ago. The emotional aftermath has largely resolved. The practical consequences have been addressed through career changes, therapy, and relationship recalibration. What remains is simply the wisdom distilled from experience, the hard-earned insights about manipulation, boundaries, and authentic connection. I've sometimes wondered whether Alex himself has changed, whether the institutional consequences implemented by Meridian's HR department had any lasting impact on his behavior, whether therapy, if he actually attended as required, provided insight into his manipulation patterns, whether he ever recognized the harm his actions caused or took responsibility for the choices he made. These questions feel less important now than they once did. His growth or stagnation is his own journey, not my responsibility or concern. My energy is better directed toward my own continued healing and the authentic connections that now form the center of my life. The publishing industry being what it is, I still hear occasional updates about Alex through mutual acquaintances. The pattern apparently continues: new emotional support people identified, cultivated, eventually exhausted and discarded, new variations on the same manipulation tactics, new institutional responses that address specific incidents without changing the underlying dynamic. This knowledge brings sadness rather than anger now. Recognition that some patterns persist because they serve deep psychological needs that remain unaddressed. Understanding that meaningful change rarely occurs without both significant consequences and genuine insight. Awareness that systems often manage problematic behaviors rather than requiring actual transformation. The emotional distance that allows this perspective represents healing in itself. The capacity to acknowledge the ongoing pattern without feeling responsible for fixing it. To care about the potential impact on others without taking on the burden of prevention, to maintain appropriate boundaries around what is and isn't my concern. If I could somehow send a message back through time to myself on that first night in the break room, I'm not sure I'd warn against offering support entirely. Compassion itself wasn't the problem. The issue was the lack of boundaries around how that compassion was expressed. The absence of recognition that crisis response should be both limited and directed toward appropriate resources rather than becoming an identity-defining role. Perhaps I'd simply say, your compassion is not unlimited access. Your support is not endless availability. Your value doesn't depend on absorbing others' pain. Your boundaries aren't negotiable features but essential expressions of selfhood. Or maybe more simply, you matter too. 5 years after that first text message, 3 years after extracting myself from the toxic dependency it spawned, this is what I carry forward: the recognition that genuine compassion includes self-compassion, that true support facilitates growth rather than enabling dependency, that healthy boundaries aren't walls but permeable membranes that allow authentic connection while preventing exploitation. I'm not grateful for what happened with Alex. The harm was real, the cost significant, the manipulation deliberate. But I am grateful for what the experience revealed about myself, about relationship dynamics, about the difference between performative caretaking and genuine connection. The person I was before Alex, the endlessly available emotional support human with porous boundaries and a savior complex, no longer exists. Neither does the hypervigilant, isolated person I briefly became during the worst of the extraction process. What exists now is someone more integrated, more authentic, more conscious about how I engage with others and what I need to thrive. Not perfect, not completely healed, not immune to future manipulation or boundary challenges, just more aware, more intentional, more committed to creating connections that nourish rather than deplete both parties involved. There's no dramatic conclusion to this story, no cinematic confrontation where Alex acknowledged the harm he caused, no public reckoning that exposed his manipulation tactics to everyone he deceived, no institutional response that fundamentally changed the system that enabled his behavior. Just the quiet, undramatic reality of gradual extraction, persistent healing, ongoing integration, the slow reclamation of my time, energy, and identity from someone who had never had the right to claim them, the steady rebuilding of a life centered around authentic priorities rather than someone else's manufactured crises. The text message that started it all, "I don't know how to make it through tonight," seems almost innocent in isolation. A human reaching out during genuine distress, a connection formed through vulnerability and response, the beginning of what could have been a balanced, mutual supportive relationship in some alternate reality. What followed was anything but innocent: the calculated escalation, the manufactured emergencies, the systematic isolation, the deliberate targeting of opportunities, the meticulous creation of an information network designed to monitor my life even after I began establishing boundaries. The contrast between that apparent vulnerability and the deliberate manipulation it masked represents the core lesson of the entire experience, that genuine need and calculated exploitation can look identical in the moment, that discernment requires both compassion and caution, that boundaries serve not to limit authentic connection but to prevent harmful entanglement. Now, 5 years later, when my phone buzzes with a text from someone in distress, I still respond with compassion, still offer support within my capacity, still connect authentically with others during their difficult moments. The experience with Alex didn't destroy my capacity to care, it just transformed how that care is expressed. The difference is consciousness, awareness of my own limits and boundaries, recognition of patterns that might indicate manipulation rather than genuine need, discernment about appropriate levels of involvement, balance between compassion for others and responsibility to myself. Not cynicism or withdrawal, but wisdom. Not fear of connection, but respect for its proper forms. Not absence of care, but care expressed sustainably rather than self-destructively. This perhaps is the ultimate resolution, not perfect healing, but integrated experience. Not complete recovery, but ongoing evolution. Not returning to who I was before, but becoming someone new, someone shaped by but not defined by what happened. Someone who can still answer a text from someone in crisis without losing myself in the process. I was there every night he cried. Now I'm just a deleted contact, and in that space between unlimited availability and complete disconnection, I found something I hadn't even known I was missing: myself.